Welcome to this edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. Well, I think the big news today is an attempted coup d'etat by the fascist governor of Michigan, the fascist Republican Snyder, the most extreme, the most ideological, the most fascist of all of those reactionary Republican governors. This is Snyder, who goes beyond Mitch Daniel in union busting. He's ahead of Walker in his dictatorial concept of politics. He's more effective than Kasich in union busting. And here's what we now have. As we heard from Reverend Pinckney of BANCO, B-A-N-C-O, the Black Autonomy organization, the Black Autonomy Network of Community Organizations. We know, and we knew from the news reports, last November, the Michigan Emergency Manager Law was overturned by a popular vote in a referendum on a ballot question in the November election. Snyder was told, you cannot appoint these little Hitlers to go into cities like Pontiac and Flint and Ecorse and the Detroit school system and Detroit itself. You cannot appoint little petty dictators who will go in there and run the cities in the interests of the banks and, of course, of their reactionary Republican cronies. You can't do it. So that was unconstitutional, according to the voters of Michigan. And as Reverend Pinckney told us a couple of weeks ago, that didn't stop Snyder. He simply turned around and passed a new emergency manager law with some small technical changes. And now, lo and behold, Snyder does not let any grass grow under his feet. He's now proposing to put the city of Detroit under dictatorship. Emergency dictatorship in Detroit. Fascist coup in the United States, step by step. Let's call it a creeping coup. A creeping fascist coup here in the United States by this Republican governor, Rick Snyder. And the news from the news on the 11th of this month, that is to say, this morning. We're recording here on the afternoon of Friday, the 11th of January, is that Snyder has sent in a team for the financial review of the accounts of the city of Detroit. And if they decide that what they find is not to their liking, with no accountability and no oversight, they can tell the mayor of Detroit, the hapless Dave Bing, and they can tell the elected Detroit City Council, go home, we don't care about you, you're under bankers' dictatorship. The bankers, the bondholders will call the shots. That's where you're headed. And, of course, don't look to Obama. Don't look to anybody in Washington to lift a finger against this. Eric Holder should be in there with injunctions and indictments against Snyder. Remember, the original Constitution says the federal government has to make sure that every state has a Republican form of government. That was then made more specific by the 14th Amendment, very much part of our armory these days on default issues and now on this. No state shall deprive anybody of life, liberty, property without due process of law. I see a dictatorship under fascist auspices. And we know from the way that this kind of austerity dictatorship has been carried out in Benton Harbor, in Flint, in Pontiac, and Ecorse, we know that what this is going to be. And I'm wondering, Michael Moore, where's the great Michigan defender Michael Moore, on this issue? Nowhere, because it's an embarrassment to the Democratic Party because they don't want to fight it. And remember also, the reason that the United Auto Workers, the biggest union in the state, is so weak is because of the killer concessions that they made to Ratner the Rat. That's Steve Ratner that you see every morning, or many mornings, on Morning Joe on MSNBC. That same guy, former New York Times correspondent, became a speculator, became a hedge fund hyena, and then Obama made him the head of the, he became the car czar under Obama. And his solution to this was blank the UAW. You can find that online. And what he meant by blank the UAW was to force the UAW, in the case of new hires, to lower the wages and working conditions to the same level, the wretched level of the sweatshop, non-unionized scab South, the southern states, the so-called right-to-work states. And, of course, now, right-to-work has come to Michigan. Let's just remember, the criteria for fascism have to be flexible. You can't make it depend only on brown shirts, black shirts, the March on Rome, or the Sturmabteilung. It cannot be simply the fascist mass movement. This especially applies to countries like Britain, the United States, and so forth, the sort of the English-speaking world where the formal democracy is a long tradition which has very deep roots and which is hard to get rid of. Under these circumstances, the coup facilitated by a rabble in the streets, the March on Rome model, is not the usual one. It could become so again, but for the moment it's not. The essence of fascism looks like, above all, union busting, the destruction of all mass organizations that might challenge a totalitarian regime. That's what we have with Snyder. If we have wage gouging, the attempt to drive down wages and social services and the standard of living, we have that too. Extreme deregulation. People who come like the Mormon Senator Lee, Rand Paul's little friend, or Rand Paul himself, I'm sure, who say child labor laws are unconstitutional. The minimum wage is unconstitutional. Unemployment benefits are unconstitutional. People who argue that are likely to be fascist. So we've got the question of unions. We've got the question of wages, deregulation. A fourth point might well be, if you're interested in shifting the tax burden from the super rich onto the working poor and the middle class, that is part of this constellation. That would also be a feature of fascism. Then you have, of course, the warmonger impulse that you're looking to pick fights with foreign enemies which may or may not exist, and racism, that there's a racist edge, animus, to all of this stuff. Well, if you look at these reactionary Republicans, that is indeed what you find, and that's what we have here with Snyder. So I urge people, go back if you didn't hear the interviews with Reverend Pinckney in the last 2 weeks. I guess it's the last of the old year and the first of the new year. Reverend Pinckney, Edward Pinckney of Benton Harbor, Michigan, Black Autonomy Network Community Organization. Take a look, and you'll find there, if you want to support him and his group, I would urge you to support him, because this is the most radical element. This is the most determined element in the coalition that's going to be fighting against Snyder as he attempts to extend a dictatorship over his state. Now, the implications for this are broader. We'll get to them in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. What's up here in Washington, D.C.? Keep up with everything on Tarpley.net, Tarpley.net. If you don't have your copy of Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America with Polygamy, Theocracy, and Subversion, this is essentially the general outlines of the attempted coup d'etat of last September, October, November. You've got to get it. The permanent austerity dictatorship that did not materialize, but you can see from what we were just talking about, the attempted fascist coup in Detroit, installing a dictator in Detroit. This never happened in the 1930s, but now it's about to happen today or the next couple of days. You can see how grave this situation is. There is a network that wants to do it this way. So that's the Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney, and the Mormon Takeover of America. Get that through Tarpley.net. If you don't have that book, you have a huge hole in your current history, right? The contemporary world, the political conditions around you. You will not be able to understand the politics of the Pentagon in particular if you don't have that, and the attempted action by Petraeus, which went pretty far. We know that Petraeus was certainly a candidate for chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff back in the middle of 2011, and how close he came, we don't know. But now we've got big shakeups going on, and you got to read it all in the light of these coup attempts. We're now in a coup dynamic. That's what people have got to understand. So that's Tarpley.net, Tarpley.net. Minute to minute, hour to hour, you've got to get on Twitter. Twitter feed, Webster G. Tarpley, Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. We're calling today for the creation of a Twitter army. Now, others have talked about Twitter armies. You've got the reactionary Hannity, who has a Twitter army, which by that he means people who listen to his Twitters. No, that's not what's involved here. The Twitter army we need is one where you put out Twitters. Now, at the beginning, if you want to use Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed as a point of reference, great, do it. Rewrite, change, adapt, whatever you want to do. But soon, you're going to be able to do this yourself, and that's what we need. We need, in particular, all kinds of zingers, because that's what this means, right? The stock and trade on Twitter is the one-line zinger, the 140-character posting, and we need that, and we need it heavy-duty, and we need it right now. Get on Twitter and attack Snyder for attempting a fascist coup in Detroit, Michigan. Use whatever language you want, right? Authoritarian power grab or outrageous, high-handed maneuver, whatever you want to call it, right? All kinds of different levels of rhetoric, and indeed, it's better if there is. So that's the Twitter army. The other one is take back the airwaves. Take back the airwaves. And by this we mean you can get on nationwide radio, right? Limbaugh, Hannity, O'Reilly, Levin, but also Ed Schultz, Tom Hartman, right? The left fakers, the people who have sold out to Obama equally, and in some cases more vulnerable these days. Call in, get on there, learn to outwit the call screeners, get on there, talk about the Wall Street sales tax, seizing the Fed, I say, nationalize, deprivatize the Fed, and start issuing those trillion-dollar tranches of 0% long-term credit for infrastructure, industry, agriculture, tangible physical production, up and down the line. That's how you get a recovery. So those two things, the Twitter army where you are a protagonist and similarly take back the airwaves, you can get on nationwide television. It's called C-SPAN. Every morning they've got a program called Washington Journal. Get on there. Call in just about every morning. It's about the fiscal cliff, or now the sequester, the default, the continuing resolution, and so forth. Get on there and get busy. Now, concerning this question of the coup, most fascist regimes reach a point where they assert emergency powers, emergency rule. This is often top-down, not always. In the case of Germany, we could say that Germany really went under emergency rule in the summer of 1930, when the last democratic government, the last government that had a majority in the Reichstag, the German parliament, was the Müller government of the SPD. this government fell over an attempt by reactionaries to cut the unemployment benefits, interestingly enough. Then we had a more severe form of dictatorship, we could say, a coup, in effect, in Prussia in July of 1932, right? Von Papen was the chancellor by that time, and he engineered an austerity coup, which left him as the dictator, or his commissar, as the dictator of Prussia. In the case then of Hitler himself, January, February 1933, the famous enabling laws allow him to assert emergency powers. Also notice, Marshal Pétain of Vichy in July 1940 in an auditorium in the more or less southern French resort of Vichy, he has an assembly there. Pierre Laval manages the bill going through the rump of the French Parliament that give emergency powers to Marshal Pétain and indeed end the French Republic that had been installed in 1875, the law of the Third Republic. So we are now in very, very dangerous territory, and people have got to understand this. And then we look at the behavior of the Republicans in the Congress, and maybe we can say that the actions of Snyder in Michigan give us a way, a commentary, a gloss, an explanation, so that we can understand the deeper meaning of the unbelievable antics, the unbelievable blackmail, extortion, sabotage, treason of the Republicans in the Congress. If you drive the United States government into default, and indeed shut down the government, you can do both. You drive the government into default and shut it down, you create a situation where emergency rule becomes easier. Very interesting. In the Vichy period, there was, of course, a significant clique called the Cagoule, or the Synarchs, the Synarchy. They thought that it was better, of course, for Germany to win the war with France, because they felt that if France were defeated, a coup by them would be much easier. So they needed the country to be defeated so that they could impose what they wanted on the institutions. And you can see that same fascist strategy can be seen in the House Republicans in general. Bankrupt the United States, and then maybe it's easier to get emergency rule. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Come back to World Crisis Radio, directing you as always to Tarpley.net and Dubai in particular. Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America, my latest book, highly relevant, goes far beyond the mere question of who would be president this month. And Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. So we have an attempted coup in Michigan. We might want to say that the activities of the fascist governor Snyder in Lansing, Michigan, are in some way the equivalent of Hitler's beer hall putsch in Munich in November 1923. Here's the headline in the Huffington Post. Detroit's fiscal future could soon be out of its hands if a team of state officials determines that the nation's former auto and manufacturing giant, is so firmly entrenched in a financial emergency that it cannot climb out on its own. This is all screwed up. And notice that the Huffington Post does not tell you that the voters, the people of Michigan, struck down, rejected, did not want the fascist emergency manager law, but Snyder has come back anyway with a slightly reworded, rephrased version of the same monstrosity. This is absolutely out of this world. And Reverend Pinckney told us that the American Civil Liberties Union was, being at least invited to do something. Hey, ACLU, this is the biggest overreach that we've seen in recent years. This is in some ways worse than the Big Mac in New York City or the Financial Review Board in Washington, D.C., the one that was dominated by Anthony Williams, who then got himself elected. This is now worse because it's not just fiscal future, because as soon as you're talking about money, you're talking about everything on which money is spent. So the timetable ahead of us now, it's expected that the United States will default between the 15th of February and the 1st of March. On the 1st of March, we have the sequester, $100 billion of defense cuts, and to have them in that form is not wise, and $100 billion in other cuts, right, this year, because each one of those is $1 trillion. And then on the 27th of March, the budget, the continuing resolution that functions in lieu of a budget and is a budget, it will also expire. So we're entering into a period, the next 2 months or so will be aggravated crisis. Now, the demagogues of the Republican Party, what they obviously believe is what I said before, that if you can force a default to impose a dictatorship ruled by decree, this gets closer. Maybe they think they can capture the weakling Obama. Maybe they think they can impeach him. Who knows what, right? Maybe there are still more generals in the Pentagon who want to try a putsch. That cannot be eliminated as a possibility. Petraeus is still around. He's still at large. Same thing with his camarilla of putschist generals. So that is the Republican strategy. Also remember, their goal, of course, is, as they say, it's to cut federal spending. It's to destroy, decimate the social safety net, roll back the economic rights of the American people, one under the New Deal, the New Frontier, and the Great Society. And they can't do it by normal electoral means with congressional votes or any other way. Therefore, they say, force the country into bankruptcy default, and then the United States will not be able to borrow, and that way we can cut the federal spending in the most radical way possible. The other thing, though, in terms of their messaging, the demagogy, the cloak that they're trying to use, if you look at this despicable Ted Cruz, the new lunatic from Texas, he's taking the place of the cheerleader, but then now we have to deal with Ted Cruz, Rafael Cruz, I believe, but Ted Cruz for political purposes. He attempts, with Hannity and others, to blur the line. He says, well, what you're dealing with here is really not a default and a bankruptcy, but a government shutdown. The hell it is. It is a bankruptcy and a default, and no stock market hedge fund hyena speculator would have any trouble in telling him that in a moment of honesty. But what you'll notice that what Cruz is saying and what Toomey the Toomer also says, right, from the Club of Growths in the Pennsylvania senator, what they say is if you default, what you can simply do is channel all your income preferentially to the bondholders. So the Republican Party is revealed as not only as the party of national sabotage, treason, blackmail, and extortion, right? It sounds like some organization in James Bond, Spectre, right? Extortion, terrorism, revenge, whatever. In the case of the Republican Party, it's extortion and blackmail, treason, and wrecking. The Republicans believe that with this they can make this kind of a power grab. Cruz attempts to blur the line, and they're revealed as the party of the foreign bondholders. So domestically, treason, blackmail, and extortion, and on the international scale, they're there to make sure that all the foreign bondholders, all the gnomes of Zurich, and the bloodsuckers of Frankfurt, and the young wolves of Shanghai, that they all get their money, huh? That's the Republican Party, not the party of Lincoln. Now, that's the one side. The other side of it is the 14th Amendment is gaining ground. You can look at my Twitter feed. You can see all sorts of people have talked about the question of the 14th Amendment. It is very, very much in the news. One interesting thing is when people like Hannity and so forth bring it up, they have to say, the Constitution says that only Congress can spend money in Article 1, but wait a minute, the 14th Amendment is also part of the Constitution. Hannity, why don't you read your viewers what the 14th Amendment says? They never do this. And they have a very, very strange idea, right, that the first article is the real Constitution, the 14th Amendment is somehow inferior. And remember, the Constitution says that is not so, that the amendments are equal in power to the articles. There is no difference in the inherent power of these pronouncements. Anyway, the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. The debt ceiling is unconstitutional. Default is illegal. Yes, default is a federal crime. And a Republican cabal could be indicted for attempting to use the Congress through a criminal conspiracy to make that go through. It's all over the place now. And again, the problem is that there are not enough people trying to make clear what the 14th Amendment actually says. But the idea that Obama could get out of this using executive orders, even O'Reilly now has to refer to this so that he won't tell you what the constitutional authority is. Now, as the 14th Amendment gains ground, which it is doing, we got this diversion of the platinum coin. The platinum coin is very problematic. It is a gimmick. It is based on a mere statute. It's based on a statute where I'm sure the Supreme Court would argue the original intent of the statute was to allow the minting of commemorative platinum coins. It does not provide a permanent solution, but only a momentary one, and it is very vulnerable to being seen as a gimmick, as a cheap trick. And we'll get back to this question of the platinum coin in just a minute.
Welcome back.
Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. So this is 14th Amendment Radio. Can't be deprived by any state, huh? State cannot deprive you of life, liberty, property without due process of law. That means you, Snyder. That means you, Michigan. And the Obama administration, of course, pretends nothing is happening, even as fascist yoke descends on the great city of Detroit. What a tragedy. Let's not get into it. It's an endless tragedy. And the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. You can even make a pretty good argument that the people trying to force a default now are, in effect, the Confederates. They're the same Confederates that were being targeted. They're the leftovers, right? The revanchists of the Confederate States of America. That's the Tea Party. Left over that were there in 1868, and unfortunately they're still there. So we just to sum up the publicity for this, O'Reilly thinks that Obama will use an executive order to keep the Treasury auctions going and avoid default. We've got Greta Van Susteren and Newt Gingrich freaking out about the 14th Amendment. Again, not telling anybody what it says. Hannity and Jay Sekulow rage against the 14th Amendment. They think that the Tea Party has to have the right to smash the USA. Human Events of January 7th says that Obama will use the 14th Amendment to raise the debt ceiling. And you've got Ted Cruz. He loves the Constitution, but somehow not the 14th Amendment. He hates it so much he won't even tell you what it is. So there's the reactionary freakout going. Ezra Klein, on the other hand, is for the funny money, the platinum coin. Anne Marie Cox, the former Wonkette, tells Martin Bashir that the Republican threats to bankrupt the country, force the bankruptcy, this is adding authority to the argument in favor of using executive orders. Stephanopoulos asked his panel if Obama will use the 14th Amendment, And the new ABC correspondent at the White House, Jonathan Karl, says, yes, it's gaining. Well, you get the idea. The 14th Amendment. Pelosi started this going, telling Bob Schieffer on January 6th, the 14th Amendment means that the president can, and I would say must, pay the national debt no matter what happens. So you get the idea. Now, the platinum coin has all these weaknesses. It is not anchored directly in the Constitution. It is merely a statute, and the argument would obviously be that this violates the original intent of the statute. Now, the reactionaries will argue that on the Constitution, too, but again, you could say, well, these people today are simply the Confederates of 1868. It's their spawn, right? Their progeny that we're dealing with. The platinum coin is not a permanent solution. It's not constitutional in the sense it's not based on an explicit constitutional norm to defend the public debt, and it can easily be lowered to the level of a trick or gimmick. Now, let's be clear. Anything is better than default. Anything. Well, anything within reason. Anything we've seen so far is better than default, but keep this, if you want to, keep this in abeyance, keep this in reserve. The left liberal mushheads find this idea appealing, like Ezra Klein, so don't worry, there will be plenty of people blabbing about the platinum coin. What we need to argue is a permanent solution, which is the moral high ground of the 14th Amendment. You're going to say, we didn't fight the Civil War and have all of those sacrifices to put down those Confederate slave-driving right-wing anarchists that we still have around, apparently. We didn't do all of that to allow some gaggle of fanatics and lunatics financed by the Koch brothers and full of Austrian ideology. That was not what we did. So, therefore, the 14th Amendment rules the roost. So this is rolling along. This is where you should intervene, among other things, on Twitter and in these Take Back the Airwaves. Now, the Wall Street sales tax. A week ago today, I guess, we had Bernie Sanders coming forth in the evening on Ed Schultz saying that he was going to submit a bill to impose a Wall Street sales tax of 1/4 to 1/2%. It was not clear how much it would be. It was not explicitly related to the derivatives trade, collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps, structured investment vehicles, and so forth. This is where most of the money is. It has to be done in that way. But he brought it up. Now, unfortunately, yesterday, the 10th of January, we had Bernie Sanders on the Ed Schultz show again, and even though he was talking about Wall Street and inequality, no mention of the Wall Street sales tax. So did a heavy hand from the Obama White House or the Federal Reserve or somebody like this come down on Bernie? Anyway, there's the situation. Now, suppose you want to get on the scoreboard. We've told you about Twitter. We've told you about Take Back the Airwaves. The other thing coming up is the inauguration, and that is now, quite frankly, next weekend, the 18th, 19th, Friday the 18th, Saturday the 19th, Sunday the 20th, and Monday the 21st. This is the combination of the Obama inauguration and the Martin Luther King holiday, 21st. If you're coming to Washington, let us know. Let me know. The United Front Against Austerity will be here. We will attempt to develop some signs, some leaflets. We will try to have points where we can all gather together and do a concentrated intervention. We can go to the White House. We can go to the Congress, the Treasury, the Federal Reserve. We can have a lot of fun, quite frankly, while doing good. So I would urge people, consider now, and we'll try to have this stuff nailed down within about 2 days. Say by the 12th or 13th of January, take a look at the United Front Against Austerity homepage, and you'll see some ideas about this. Now, the other thing to be aware of. The balanced budget amendment is back. It's a pure demagogy, right? This is pure suicide. It's pure garbage, frankly, at this point. It's recycled garbage from Newt Gingrich and these people from 10, 15 years ago. But it's back. So the idea is Ted Cruz and Human Event says that the way for the Republicans to regroup is around a popular reform like the balanced budget amendment. Well, wait just a minute. It's not popular. It's hated. It means genocide. It's going to kill people. We can't do that. This is what Ron Paul wanted, right? He wanted $1 trillion of cuts in the first year and then balance the budget within a presidential term. The deaths would have been counted in the millions because you'd be destroying food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, S-chip, WIC, so forth. So if people start spouting balanced budget, remind them, hey, when you were running for office, you talked about jobs, 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 and now that you're safely out of reach of the voters for a couple of years, now you're spouting balanced budget amendment. What happened, dear Republican and Democratic fakers, oligarchs, traitors, and so forth? The general welfare. Well, the other thing, of course, is they're always harping on this, right? Remember, for these reactionaries, the Constitution is simply a buzzword. It's just a cloak for what they want to do. We've seen it, right? Hannity says, to pay the debt is against the Constitution because of Article 1. Wait a minute, how about the 14th Amendment? Oh, no, that doesn't apply. And similarly here, Article 1 actually says Congress can borrow money, and these reactionaries come along and say, no, Congress cannot borrow money, down with the Constitution. Well, fight them. We'll be back in a second on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, our second hour here on the 11th of January, second program here in the new year. We're just wrapping up now the coverage on the economic battles. This is essentially austerity yes, austerity no, and we're here to say austerity no. Austerity kills. To propose austerity cuts in the food stamp budget is to be guilty of a Nuremberg crime, high crime against humanity. You knew or you should have known. And don't tell us you were following orders. This goes for quite a few of them. And at the same time, the austerity doesn't work in its own terms. It will not lead to a balanced budget. That's what you see in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal. In a depression, you cut the budget, you destroy government jobs. That's partly the story here in the United States. You destroy social services. You lower the general level of economic activity, which is largely being maintained by government spending. And at that point, workers turn into welfare recipients or unemployment benefit collectors, and the deficit increases. This is the insanity. You're going to kill people to increase the deficit. Of course, they don't care. This is class instinct. The ultimate underlying goal is not really to balance the budget. It's to destroy the social safety net, drive down wages, ruin working conditions, and if they can have a deflationary crash, that's really what they love. That was the Ron Paul, and I'm sure Rand Paul, Austrian school version. If you have a lot of money, you feel that the Federal Reserve printing money is undermining the value of the money you have hoarded, and therefore you want to stop them doing that, and you would like deflation, because when deflation occurs and you're sitting on a pile of money, you can go out and buy up the world. You can buy people, factories, real estate at bargain basement prices, and your money becomes worth more. So that is the essence of the Austrian position. If you are an Austrian and you're not rich, you're a damn fool, and you better review your entire position. Now, the other thing we've had this past week is a campaign about welfare recipients misusing their payments. The irony of this is there is no more welfare. Welfare is long gone. Welfare was destroyed by Bill Clinton in 1996 to get himself reelected. It was called the worst thing that Clinton has done. There was at least one Undersecretary of Health and Human Services who quit over this issue, wrote an article about it in the Atlantic Monthly. The worst thing Clinton has done. You didn't need to hurt people, Clinton. You were going to beat Dole anyway, but you wanted an insurance policy. That's immorality. That is wretched. That is despicable. But now these lunatics today, O'Reilly has got to pretend that there's still welfare. There is no welfare. Aid to families with dependent children, one of the titles of the Social Security Act of 1935, is gone, has been gone for 15 plus long years. What you have today is TAMF, temporary assistance to needy families. It lasts for a few weeks. It's a big nothing. I think what they're referring to is food stamps in most of these cases, right? That food stamps now come as a kind of a cash card, a debit card. But they're crazy. Imagine the reactionaries. Look, fascist delirium is you pretend that there's welfare when there is none. It's gone, and still you're going to get into a blather about it. All right, now we have to remember when we look at Obama's latest round of appointments, which we'll begin to do today. Remember that we have now just come through an acute phase of coup d'etat at the Washington level, right? We have one going on in Lansing, Michigan, and Detroit, but at the Washington level, we had a quasi-putsch, and the names associated with this, the heads that have rolled, and we don't know, of course, which of these were active putches. We sort of know that the whole constellation revolves around General Petraeus. I identified him, you'll remember, in 2009, 2010, as the top focus of Bonapartist tendencies in the U.S. government. Bonapartism means Napoleon, right? It means the coup d'etat of the 18th of Brumaire in November, and back in the French Revolution, 1799, I believe. So that's Petraeus. But the names we want to just keep in mind as we discuss this: Petraeus, General Allen, the Afghanistan commander, was supposed to go to NATO, not yet. General Ham, U.S. AFRICOM, that's where Benghazi was. Stavridis, Admiral Stavridis, the current NATO commander, the head of the Missile Defense Organization. Admiral Gaulet, the head of a task force of aircraft carriers in the Arabian Sea. We had the commander of that frigate that had a drunken orgy in Vladivostok. We have the head of Lockheed getting Watergated out for sexual harassment. Senator DeMint departed precipitously. What could it mean? The Gallup poll under financial attack by the U.S. government. This was the Gallup poll which falsified the reports on the voting patterns, the likely vote, and gave credibility in advance to what might have been a large election fraud operation. That was the net effect. And then Karl Rove and his Orca organization, billed as a get-out-the-vote operation, didn't do too well with that. Some say this was a vote fraud organization. That was what Anonymous claimed, and who knows who Anonymous is, but that was designed to hack into the vote counting computers of various states. So we have all of that. What else do we have? The Washington Post has since revealed that General Petraeus was palsy-walsy with Frederick Kagan from the American Enterprise Institute. We've always called him Field Marshal Kagan here, this pudgy think tanker. And Kimberly Kagan, Kim Kagan of the Institute for the Study of War. Notice it's not war and peace, but only war. Neocon Madame. And some of her people, you can hear them. They appear in policy discussions now. It's amazing, what money will do. Get the money, endow an institute, get some quackademics in there and have them start pontificating, and you can move public opinion. Petraeus, Frederick Kagan, Kimberly Kagan, and how they were cavorting all around Afghanistan, essentially giving orders to U.S. troops, acting as if they were part of the chain of command at certain moments. It looks like from where we sit here. Also, at the beginning of December, we have this interesting article in the Washington Post style section where Bob Woodward tells us that Rupert Murdoch, the nefarious British Empire press baron, called Petraeus and urged him to run for president. And Petraeus, according to this, declined. Who knows how much of this we can believe. The Guardian also tells us that Petraeus, up until his ouster a couple of months ago now, wanted to attack Syria. Stanley McChrystal, has written a book. He's on book tour. And with this, we can revisit that incident a couple of years ago now, where, of course, he had this journalist attached to his staff, and they were bad-mouthing Obama. They were engaging in seditious gossip against the commander-in-chief. And this forced Obama to get rid of McChrystal. This is a window into the actual mentality of this network, I believe, what we saw with McChrystal. No love lost on Obama here, but these guys represent sedition. Back in a minute. Welcome back to our World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Tarpley.net to keep up with the world. Webster G. Tarpley to keep up with everything minute to minute, hour to hour. Get yourself a copy of Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America. So we're just going through this interesting pattern, all these pieces of evidence flying around that have to do with the likely attempted power grab or coup or putsch under the cover of the presidential election that somehow was supposed to install Romney, but somehow didn't, and that meant that a lot of putschists were left out on a limb. Intelligence warfare continues in Washington, D.C. Washington Post tells us that the prostitutes in Cartagena, Colombia, that were engaged by the Secret Service, we actually had the Drug Enforcement Administration doing the pimping to procure these charming ladies. So another element, McChrystal on book tour, and remember, he had gone very far in dissing Barkey, and Barkey had to fire him, but it seems to me that McChrystal was a sample of what these military circles think of Obama. If you go back to, and I hope you will, Obama the Postmodern Coup, the making of a Manchurian Candidate, actually it's really in the Barack H. Obama, the unauthorized biography. If in those days of mid-2008, I speculated, how will Obama be able to control the military? It won't be easy, and I thought he would do it by increasing the budget. But you can see no matter how much he increased the budget, like Septimius Severus back in the Roman Empire, he still couldn't buy the loyalty of these people who held him in contempt no matter what he did, because, all sorts of reasons. So that was what McChrystal was voicing. But now we have McChrystal essentially paraded as an elder statesman. Maybe Petraeus will be writing a book and he can get on TV. The other one, we have a whole bunch of intrigue. We'll talk about this in coming weeks. A lot of intrigue around the Joint Chiefs of Staff when Admiral Mullen went out and General Dempsey came in. There was much intrigue, and we'll have to go through this. This was sort of middle 2011. But then we have the Washington Post magazine, August 26, 2012, and on the cover we have Gwyneth Todd. And Gwyneth Todd, the headline, "Why was a top Navy advisor stripped of her career?" And this is somebody that we might want to look at together with Broadwell and old Jill the Jill Kelly, the social liaison there of the Central Command. Gwyneth Todd was a Middle East expert in the National Security Council under Clinton. She worked in the office of Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney in the first Bush administration. They were already planning, the neoconservatives already planning to attack Iraq. In 2007, Gwyneth Todd, age 42, was a top political advisor to the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. And at that point, we're told, this is now reported by retired Admiral David C. Nichols, Deputy CENTCOM commander in 2007. He told the Washington Post that Admiral Fox Fallon, the commander of CENTCOM, this is all focused there in Tampa, remember, with Jill Kelly and perhaps Broadwell running around. Fallon wanted to do a freedom of navigation exercise in what Iran calls its territorial waters, which we had not done in a long time. And Todd was alarmed because this might turn into the Gulf of Tonkin, 1964. So it's interesting. You get these people like the admirals, the people in CENTCOM would invite in all kinds of civilians to essentially become embedded and groupies. Nichols and Walsh were trying to avoid clashes with Iran, we read here. But Cosgriff, Vice Admiral Kevin J. Cosgriff, at that time commander of the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, under CENTCOM, Cosgriff wanted to mix it up. He wanted to send in 2 aircraft carriers, 1 amphibious helicopter assault ship, 5 supporting warships in May 2007, send that through the Straits of Hormuz. This was exactly at the time that a U.S.-Iranian diplomatic contact was scheduled. He's obviously trying to sabotage that. Gwyneth Todd found out about it. She called a family friend at the State Department Iran desk. That alerted the higher-ups. Cosgriff was told to stand down. Cosgriff was furious about the expletive storm coming down on him from Washington. You get the idea. And then, before too long, old Gwyneth Todd gets a visit from an FBI agent who tries to impersonate a consular official and tries to get her to talk to him, and she flees to Australia. Wow, what a story of intrigue. As the article stresses, it sounds like it's out of some kind of a fictitious account. Anyway, that's all background. In other words, we've got to keep the coup in mind, because the coup is still there. This network has been hit, but certainly it's still there. This is the invisible government we're talking about, the people who do what they want, quite independent of the president, and they can go rogue in a very bloody way anytime they want to. Let's look now. We have Hagel for defense, Kerry for state, Liu for treasury, Brennan for CIA. Let's get Liu out of the way first. The answer is no. We're calling for the Senate to reject Liu. He is a city banker. He comes out of the school of Pandit the Bandit. Above all, during the Clinton years, Liu was instrumental in 2 of the biggest crimes which opened the way, really set the U.S. up for the crisis of 2007-2008. That is to say, the abolition of Glass-Steagall in 1999, and that includes the end of the prohibition of interstate banking, but above all, the idea that a bank can also be a investment house and an insurance company. This was the demand of Sandy Weil. He wanted to merge Travelers with Citibank. He got his way. That's Liu's pedigree right there. So he abolished Glass-Steagall in 1999. He got paid off by going to Citibank. And he's the guy who deregulated derivatives, opened the door to derivatives in 2000. So Liu should not ever be Secretary of the Treasury. Down with Liu. And we'll be back in a minute. Come back to World Crisis Radio, Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C., Tarpley.net, and Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed to keep up with the world and Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America, the in-depth program for the current phase. And we were just talking about the various putschists or putsch plans or rumors of putsch and coup, the reality of one out there in Lansing and in Detroit. So we've just said Jack Lew must not be Secretary of Treasury, a city banker who wiped out the Glass-Steagall Law in 1999 and gave free rein to derivatives. It was Lew that was the final destroyer of the Commodity Exchange Act of 1936, which had protected the United States from toxic derivatives, and he opened the door wide. John Forbes Kerry for Secretary of State, no on general principles, Boston Brahmin oligarch, married into a Salazar family, colonial Portuguese family, and just not good. So we're not in favor of Kerry. We could go on for quite a while about that. Brennan, no. This is now Mr. Terror Tuesdays. The cover line in the press here is that he wants to de-emphasize the role of the CIA as a killing machine. He wants to have less in the way of drones and more in the way of trench coats and spies and so forth. I think this is completely fantastic. He's interested in drones, right? Remember the differences between these two factions, to the extent that there are any, is that the neocons want direct U.S. bombing, direct U.S. invasion with the Israelis involved, and they want conventional war. They want to keep 50 to 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. They wanted to keep something like that in Iraq. They never let go. This other group is more sophisticated, maybe more dangerous. They want economic sanctions, color revolutions. They want drones. They want assassinations. They want subversion. They're interested in cyber warfare. They're interested in playing one country against another. Don't you attack Libya, play France against Libya. Don't you attack Syria, play Turkey against Syria. That is the Kerry-Brennan approach. And then, so we're against those. We're against all of those. Kerry, no. Lew, no. Brennan, no. Now, with Hagel, we're neutral. Hagel, we can't forget that his career started because his family bought a share of the Sequoia voting machines in Nebraska. This is no paragon of anything. And remember, his objection to economic sanctions and economic warfare is he said he didn't want unilateral U.S. sanctions because those give other countries a competitive advantage. He wanted binding international sanctions, Security Council sanctions, where you can force everybody to go along. He has said some things against the Israelis. Fine. I can remember James Baker III saying he gave out his phone number, and he said, if the Israelis want to call me, they should call me. There were clashes of Mad Dog Bush the Elder with the Israelis, of James Baker III with the Israelis, and repeatedly. It goes back to Gerald Ford. At that time, General George Brown said the Israelis are a burden. Simply sniping at the Israelis doesn't mean anything because this is the stock in trade of the realist or Brzezinski, soft power, Joseph Nye, trilateral faction. On the other hand, it might be worth something at some point. So neutral on Hegel. Let Hegel fight the neocons. And as we've often said, when evil fights evil, possibly good can benefit. So that's the line. Now, the thing is, you got to interpret all of that. They say, why didn't Obama choose Michelle Flournoy in the Pentagon to become the head of it, right? They wanted more women and so forth. Well, you got to figure out where did these people stand in that putsch effort, right? You got to basically try to label the players, and this is going to take a while. I noticed that Hilda Solis is quitting as Secretary of Labor. What a pathetic tenure she has had. Refused to lift a finger to do anything. It doesn't look like she lifted a finger to defend the unions in Wisconsin, in Indiana, in Ohio, in Michigan, and in other states. I remember when the AFL-CIO organized a march on Washington one summer. The Obama administration sent nobody. The one person they might have sent would have been the Secretary of Labor. But no. So there we go. The whole question of diversity is posed wrongly. What we need is ideological diversity. Right? The problem with the Obama cabinet is plutocrats, Malthusians, speculators, Wall Street puppets. Most of them think the same. Neoliberals, monetarists, neoliberals. We need American system economists. We would need even a populist would be good, right? If that's the best you can do. So when we have Pelosi and others saying, "Look, we have all these women," or "Look at all the minority groups we have," that's fine. But now don't vote to strip us of our economic rights, please. Whoever you are, right? Whatever your gender or other orientation. Now, short notes on foreign policy. The imperialists are now in a manic mood because they think they're about to get rid of Assad, and they think they're about to get rid of Chavez of Venezuela. I can only hope that they don't get rid of either of them. Assad has every reason to stay on. We congratulate Assad for his self-assured and defiant speech of last Sunday. That is the only possible thing the head of a sovereign state could say. We wish Commander Chavez the best of health, and if this is not granted to us, then Maduro, I believe, is the foreign minister secretary, the possible replacement for Chavez, and the important thing there would be to continue a policy of national independence. Today in Washington, we have Karzai. I'm going to start calling him Najib Karzai, going back to Najibullah in 1988, 89, 90, right? His regime lasted for 3 years after the Soviets left, after which he had a very unfortunate end. Is the same thing waiting for Karzai. The word now is that the U.S. may pull everybody out. In other words, we may have in Afghanistan the same thing that we've had in Iraq, and I suppose that is probably the most rational solution. But again, this feeds back into these warmongers that we've talked about. The neocons and their military coterie are extremely anxious not to see Afghanistan completely liquidated. Remember, the goal of all that was supposed to be to start a civil war in Pakistan and break up Pakistan, and they haven't been able to do that yet. So they want to be able to keep some kind of a capability to attack Pakistan through Afghanistan, to export the civil war of Afghanistan. That was the West Point speech of December 2009, and now, of course, it's 3 years later plus, and that didn't work. The neocons don't like the idea of being without a war, and naturally they wish to vindicate the honor of their lunatic faction. Then we've got the British wanting to renegotiate their role in the European Union. And all I can say is de Gaulle was right. The British would never, under the current British oligarchy, unless you could sweep away the Foreign Office, the city, the court, and a whole bunch of other institutions, they'll never be a part of Europe. They'll only be a Trojan horse for the Anglo-American banking power. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Our final segment, we want to just take a quick look at the gun debate in the context of wedge issues. Now, remember, from 1932 to 1968, the U.S. was governed by a New Deal coalition of the cities, labor, the South, farmers in many cases, soldiers. We can make a strong case that the New Deal coalition, the national coalition from 32 to 68, is the natural form of a majority coalition for the modern United States with certain changes, add Hispanics and so forth, but the general idea remains the same. From 1968 to 2008, the Southern strategy was the one used by the reactionary Republicans, but inherently the Southern strategy is unstable and has to be shored up by attempts to fragment the residual New Deal coalition in many states, in particular in California, New York, and elsewhere. And some places this never really succeeded completely. So we have the wedge issue. The wedge issue used to divide. These are issues quite often where both sides are plausible, both sides of the issue have a certain logic, and above all, they have some public support, and you can use this to chip away at the New Deal coalition. The term, I think, comes originally from Lee Atwater. He was working in South Carolina for Strom Thurmond after Strom Thurmond became a Republican, and therefore he had to fight the Democrats, and the only way to do that was to use wedge issues. Now let's look at some wedge issues. The original wedge issues back in the 70s to 80s, I would say, were guns, that is gun control, God, school prayer in particular, gays, that would be gay marriage. We saw Karl Rove use that in 2004. Abortion, of course. Race, tremendously important. Busing, things like this. Even the Koch brothers in North Carolina, I believe, is still fighting along about that one. As time goes on, busing, at least as a nationwide focus, recedes. Gay marriage is no longer has the mass traction that it had even in 2004. School prayer, you don't hear too much about that. I would say the main wedge issues of our time now are guns, anti-foreigner, xenophobia, abortion, contraception, put those together with the reactionary Republicans, the transvaginal lobby in Virginia and other states, and let's add global warming. Global warming is a wedge issue, this time deployed by leftists. It was used by Al Gore to break the anti-Bush momentum in early 2007. After the Democrats had seized control of both houses of Congress, Al Gore came forward with his inconvenient truth. The desire there is to break the thrust towards impeachment of Bush and ending the wars, to weaken that. So that's what he did. This time around, of course, we mentioned Naomi Klein, Bill Moyers, and others early this year saying now is the golden opportunity for carbon taxes and things like this. Now, both sides are sometimes plausible. Some of them, they're completely indefensible, but they still have support. I guess the thing to say is both sides have some kind of popular support. Now, when it comes to guns, I would refer you back to those interesting sociological studies of the black ghetto, of the inner city ghetto in the 80s, where we find sociologists writing about how the real powerlessness, the exclusion, the misery, frankly, of ghetto populations, people attempt to compensate by guns, right? Saturday night specials, whatever it is. And above all, among younger people, younger men with no fathers, how they need to compensate for their feelings of inadequacy with a gun. That this is a way to get respect. If somebody disses you, you can respond by pulling out a gun. Notice, this means that your identity, your human identity, is projected onto a thing, a gun in this case. The idea that your social identity depends on owning something, well, that's alienation, right? That's fetishism. Notice now today, among right-wingers who essentially duplicate the same pattern, they're trying to compensate for powerlessness, exclusion, and other feelings of inadequacy and lack of personal worth. They're trying to compensate for that with a gun. They fall into alienation and fetishism, and they do the same thing with gold. They think that productivity and wealth are located in gold. No, it's not. Located in human labor. And that your human identity is located in a gun. Power is located in a gun? No. Power is located in political organization. Political organization is the root of power in human affairs. Now, whether guns arrive, that's a later question. Mao knew this. People often quote Mao saying, it comes out of the barrel of a gun. Well, that's not really what Mao did. His main thrust is to build organization, and then you see what comes after that. So organization trumps guns. Now, I would also say the argument we hear that gun ownership is a protection against tyranny, I think that is an argument that will not hold water. Not with the modern weapons, not with cluster bombs, not with gas, neutron bombs, you name it. This is not going to work. And it seems to me it simply it's used as a replacement. It's a substitute for the political organization that you actually need. On the other hand, there is a plausible case that in a collapsing society with social chaos going around, self-defense of individuals against criminals and so forth, this has a certain plausibility. But again, the answer to that, I would submit, is the goal of civilization is that in most cases it's better to have the armed force being exercised by a legally constituted government rather than by individuals, by sort of Robinson Crusoe alienated, fragmented individuals, and certainly better than having armed gangs, armed militias. Of course, the hypocrisy is there. Sidwell Friends, where they send their kids, plenty of armed guards. Politicians have armed guards. What about the citizen? All of that makes sense. We should also point out in passing that since we had the southern and rural domination of 1968 to 2008, southern and rural ideas about guns, ideology of gun ownership, fetishism, certainly, all of these also come to the fore. Perhaps as the southern strategy declines, this ideology would also decline. So what do? And here's my answer. What's the policy? You do not take sides on a wedge issue. You attack the wedge issue as such. If you don't do that, you're accepting the enemy imposing his will on you. The main issue right now is genocidal austerity, yes or no. We're told that 11,000 people get killed in the United States every year through gun violence. Well, if you start cutting food stamps, if you do what Ron Paul wanted to do and cut 63% out of the food stamp budget, it's about $80 billion, 50 million people live on it. Well, you start cutting that, it's not 11,000, it's 100,000, 500,000, or a million dead. In other words, the economic issues kill orders of magnitude more than the gun violence. And if you're concerned about state-sponsored genocide, well, you see that in Michigan. And are the gun people there opposing Snyder? Is the Michigan militia telling Snyder to back off? I don't see it. I see the opposite. I see that the people who are most interested in guns are the ones who are most open to union-busting, wage-gouging, genocidal austerity arguments. So again, what do we want to do? Let's take the model of Lincoln. Let's get it right with Lincoln. Lincoln was confronted by these Mormons, right? We talked about it. Lincoln facing Brigham Young, who wanted to secede. He wanted to open a new front in the Civil War. And what Abe Lincoln said to Brigham Young is, I'm going to leave you alone. If you have a stump in a field which is too hard to chop up, it's too heavy to move and too wet to burn, you plow around it. Leave it alone. The way you solve the gun problem is right now there is no direct solution. Get full employment, get prosperity, pacify the society, and these issues will then become tractable. Right now they're not. So that is my approach. What Abe Lincoln offered to Brigham Young, leave it alone. Let's get busy on the real front. Wall Street sales tax, seize the Fed, 14th Amendment. We'll see you next week on World Crisis Radio. On Rome, or the Sturmabteilung, it cannot be simply the fascist mass movement. This especially applies to countries like Britain, the United States, and so forth, the sort of the English-speaking world where the formal democracy is a long tradition which has very deep roots and which is hard to get rid of. Under these circumstances, the coup facilitated by a rabble in the streets, the March on Rome model, is not the usual one. It could become so again, but for the moment it's not. The essence of fascism looks like, above all, union busting, the destruction of all mass organizations that might challenge a totalitarian regime. That's what we have with Snyder. If we have wage gouging, the attempt to drive down wages and social services and the standard of living. We have that too. Extreme deregulation. People who come like the Mormon Senator Lee, Rand Paul's little friend, or Rand Paul himself, I'm sure, who say child labor laws are unconstitutional. The minimum wage is unconstitutional. Unemployment benefits are unconstitutional. People who argue that are likely to be fascists. So we've got the question of unions. We've got the question of wages, deregulation. A fourth point might well be, if you're interested in shifting the tax burden from the super review of the accounts of the city of Detroit, and if they decide that what they find is not to their liking, with no accountability and no oversight, they can tell the mayor of Detroit, the hapless Dave Bing, and they can tell the elected Detroit City Council, go home, we don't care about you, you're under bankers' dictatorship. The bankers, the bondholders will call the shots. That's where you're headed. And, of course, don't look to Obama. Don't look to anybody in Washington to lift a finger against this. Eric Holder should be in there with injunctions and indictments against Snyder. Remember, the original Constitution says the federal government has to make sure that every state has a Republican form of government. That was then made more specific by the 14th Amendment, very much part of our armory these days on default issues and now on this. No state shall deprive anybody of life, liberty, property without due process of law. I see a dictatorship under fascist auspices. And we know from the way that this kind of austerity dictatorship has been carried out in Benton Harbor, in Flint, in Pontiac, and welcome to this edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. Well, I think the big news today is an attempted coup d'etat by the fascist governor of Michigan, the fascist Republican Snyder, the most extreme, the most ideological, the most fascist of all of those reactionary Republican governors. This is Snyder, who goes beyond Mitch Daniel in union busting. He's ahead of Walker in his dictatorial concept of politics. He's more effective than Kasich in union busting. And here's what we now have. As we heard from Reverend Pinckney of BANCO, B-A-N-C-O, the Black Autonomy organization, the Black Autonomy Network of Community Organizations. We know, and we knew from the news reports, last November, the Michigan Emergency Manager Law was overturned by a popular vote in a referendum on a ballot question in the November election. Snyder was told, you cannot appoint these little Hitlers to go into cities like Pontiac and Flint and Ecorse and the Detroit school system and Detroit Ecorse. We know that what this is going to be. And I'm wondering, Michael Moore, where's the great Michigan defender Michael Moore on this issue? Nowhere, because it's an embarrassment to the Democratic Party because they don't want to fight it. And remember also, the reason that the United Auto Workers, the biggest union in the state, is so weak is because of the killer concessions that they made to Ratner the Rat. That's Steve Ratner that you see every morning, or many mornings, on Morning Joe on MSNBC. That same guy, former New York Times correspondent, became a speculator, became a hedge fund hyena, and then Obama made him the head of the, he became the car czar under Obama. And his solution to this was blank the UAW. You can find that online. And what he meant by blank the UAW was to force the UAW in the case of new hires, to lower the wages and working conditions to the same level, the wretched level of the sweatshop, non-unionized scab South, the southern states, the so-called right-to-work states. And, of course, now right-to-work has come to Michigan. Let's just remember, the criteria for fascism have to be flexible. You can't make it depend only on brown shirts, black shirts, the march itself. You cannot appoint little petty dictators who will go in there and run the cities in the interests of the banks and, of course, of their reactionary Republican cronies. You can't do it. So that was unconstitutional, according to the voters of Michigan. And as Reverend Pinckney told us a couple of weeks ago, that didn't stop Snyder. He simply turned around and passed a new emergency manager law with some small technical changes. And now, lo and behold, Snyder does not let any grass grow under his feet. He's now proposing to put the city of Detroit under dictatorship. Emergency dictatorship in Detroit. Fascist coup in the United States, step by step. Let's call it a creeping coup. A creeping fascist coup here in the United States by this Republican governor, Rick Snyder. And the news from the news on the 11th of this month, that is to say, this morning. We're recording here on the afternoon of Friday, the 11th of January, is that Snyder has sent in a team for the financial review